The drawing-room door opened, and Duke Lucas Blackwood stepped inside Blackwood Hall with Lady Beatrice Marshall on his arm. She was dressed like a woman who already owned the house. Her ivory silk gown swept the marble floor. Her pearls caught the light from every candelabra. Her chin was lifted at an angle that expected applause. Behind her walked Anna. Anna Whitmore, the maid, moved through the doorway with both hands wrapped around a heavy travel cloak, her eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders drawn in, as though she were trying to take up less air than anyone else in the room. Beatrice had spoken to her twice on the journey, once to complain about the folding of the cloak, once to tell her to walk faster and stop lagging like something half forgotten. Anna had said nothing both times. That was what she always did. She said nothing, moved quietly, made herself small, and survived. The Dowager Duchess Augusta Blackwood rose from her chair. Every person in that drawing room went still. The footmen stood straighter. Mrs. Helena Rowe, the housekeeper, pressed her hands together. Thomas Reed, the senior footman, standing nearest the door, stopped breathing for what felt like a very long time. They were all waiting for Augusta to greet the woman Lucas had chosen, the woman he intended to marry. The future Duchess of Blackwood. Augusta walked forward. She moved past Lucas. She moved past Beatrice. She moved past the pearls and the ivory silk and the lifted chin. She stopped directly in front of Anna, and then the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, one of the most powerful women in all of Regency England, lowered herself into a curtsy so deep and so deliberate that every servant in the room forgot for a moment how to breathe. Anna's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Beatrice went perfectly white. Lucas stood with his arm still extended, as though his future bride were still attached to it, staring at his mother, as though she had just set the house on fire. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fire in the hearth crackled. Somewhere in the corridor, a clock continued to tick, as though the world had not just rearranged itself. What would you have done? If you had brought home the woman you planned to marry, if you had walked through your own family's door with her on your arm and pride in your chest, only for your mother to walk past her entirely and bow slowly and deliberately to the maid standing behind her. Would you defend your future bride? Would you question your mother? Or would you finally look, truly look, at the woman everyone around you had been treating like dust? Before we go back to Blackwood Hall, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Follow for more. Your comments help more than you know. Now, let's get back to the story. The curtsy lasted only a few seconds, but in those few seconds, the entire social order of Blackwood Hall shifted beneath everyone's feet like ground that had quietly decided it was done holding steady. Augusta rose slowly from the curtsy. Her back was straight. Her expression was composed. There was nothing confused about her face, nothing apologetic, nothing that suggested she had made an error and was searching for a graceful way to correct it. She looked, if anything, like a woman who had waited a long time to do exactly what she had just done and was quietly relieved to have it. Anna had not moved. She was still holding the travel cloak with both hands. Her knuckles had gone pale against the dark wool. Her eyes were wide and fixed on the Dowager Duchess with an expression caught somewhere between terror and incomprehension. The look of someone who has been standing in an empty field and has just heard thunder directly overhead. Lucas was the first to speak. He let out a short sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a cough, and stepped forward with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire adult life managing difficult rooms. "Mother," he said, his voice light and careful, "I believe the journey has left us all somewhat disoriented. Allow me to present Lady Beatrice Marshall, whom I intend." "I am not disoriented, Lucas." Augusta's voice was pleasant, entirely pleasant. That was what made it so dangerous. "I know exactly where I am. I know exactly before whom I stand." Her eyes did not move from Anna. Beatrice had not made a sound. That was unusual for a woman who, in Lucas's experience, always had something precise and well-constructed to say. She stood with her hand resting on his arm and her smile still arranged on her face, but it had stopped reaching her eyes approximately 30 seconds ago, and now sat there alone, doing its best without support. Thomas Reed, standing near the door with his hands clasped behind his back, was staring at a point on the wall above the fireplace with the focused intensity of a man determined to see absolutely nothing. Mrs. Rowe had folded her hands in front of her apron and was watching Augusta with an expression that was unreadable but very, very alert. Anna found her voice. It came out quietly. It almost always came out quietly. "Your Grace," she said, "you should not. This is not. I am only the—" She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Please, Your Grace, you should not bow to me." Augusta looked at her then, with something that was not quite pity and not quite sorrow, and was perhaps the particular expression worn by people who have owed a debt for a very long time and have only just found the person they owe it to. "No," Augusta said softly. "I should have done it much sooner." Beatrice found her voice. It came back to her in full, polished and controlled, which was impressive considering what it had been through in the last 2 minutes. "Your Grace." She stepped forward, disengaging gently from Lucas's arm with the smooth precision of a woman who had rehearsed this introduction many times in private and was not prepared to surrender it to a maid with a travel cloak and no explanation. "I am certain there has been some confusion. These things happen after long journeys. I am Lady Beatrice Marshall, and I am very pleased to. There is no confusion." Augusta turned to face her. The pleasantness remained. That was the most unsettling part. Augusta did not raise her voice. She did not narrow her eyes. She simply turned and looked at Beatrice with the calm, unhurried attention of a woman who had already decided what she thought and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "I am Augusta Blackwood. I know who you are, Lady Beatrice." A beat of silence. "Then perhaps," Beatrice said, each word placed with the careful delicacy of someone stepping across ice she suspects is thin, "Your Grace might explain the meaning of what just occurred." "I greeted a guest. You greeted a servant. I greeted someone I recognized." Augusta said it simply, as though it settled everything. "Whether you understand that recognition is a separate matter entirely." Beatrice's composure held. It was remarkable, really. Lucas had seen men twice her age crack under less. She kept her chin level and her voice even, but something behind her eyes had shifted from social discomfort into something harder and more watchful. And Lucas, who had known Beatrice for 7 months and had spent most of that time deciding she was admirable, noticed it now for the first time and found he did not know what to do with what he was seeing. "I think," Beatrice said, turning to Lucas with an expression that invited him to agree, "that the Duchess is unwell. The hour is late. It would perhaps better to—" "I am perfectly well," Augusta said, still pleasantly. "Better, I think, than I have been in some time." Beatrice closed her mouth. The fire crackled. Nobody in the room moved to speak first, and so nobody did, and the silence sat among them all like a fifth person who had arrived without being invited and showed no interest in leaving. Lucas tried again. This was, he reflected, already requiring more effort than arriving home from a month's absence ought to require, and the evening had not yet included supper. "Mother." He moved to her side and placed a hand gently at her elbow, a gesture he had used since boyhood when he wanted her attention without appearing to demand it. "I have looked forward to this introduction for some weeks. Lady Beatrice has made the journey specifically too. Lady Beatrice is tired from road," Augusta said agreeably. "She should rest." Then she turned away from him entirely, and from Beatrice, and looked instead at Anna, who was still standing near the doorway, with the cloak pressed to her chest like something she was protecting, or perhaps hiding behind. "My dear," Augusta said, "have you been given supper? Have you been given rest? Anna blinked. It was the look of someone being addressed in a language they understood perfectly, but had not expected to hear directed at them. Yes. Your Grace, I am. Have you been given rest? Augusta repeated, not impatient, simply precise. I am well, Your Grace. Anna's voice dropped slightly. Please, I do not wish to cause difficulty. You are not causing difficulty, Augusta said. Others are causing difficulty. There is a difference, and I would like you to know that I see it clearly. Lucas looked at his mother for a long moment. He had known this woman his entire life. He had watched her manage state dinners, navigate poisonous social seasons, outlast 3 separate scandals involving men who had underestimated her, and bury her husband with a composure that the whole county had mistaken for coldness, but that Lucas had recognized, because he knew her, as the discipline of someone who would grieve privately and not provide spectacle for strangers. She was not a woman who made errors. She was not a woman who confused maids for guests or guests for maids. She was also not a woman who did anything without a reason. He looked at Anna. She was young. Dark hair pinned severely back, a plain dress that had been mended near one cuff, a small gold locket at her throat that he had not noticed before and could not read from where he stood, tired eyes that flinched very slightly every time Beatrice shifted her weight, which was the kind of thing a man noticed only when he was finally looking carefully enough to see it. He looked back at his mother. She was watching him look. He cleared his throat and said nothing useful. Beatrice had had enough. She was not a woman built for invisibility. She was not a woman who had spent 23 years becoming exactly the kind of person a duke ought to marry, educated, poised, strategically lovely, socially perfect in every room she entered, in order to stand in her future mother-in-law's drawing room and be ignored in favor of the help. This is extraordinary. She said it quietly, but with a clarity that cut across the room. I have traveled for 2 days. I have been received in courts, in the houses of earls, in rooms considerably finer than this one. I have been introduced to duchesses, to ambassadors, to at least one crowned head of a minor principality. I have never, she paused, composing herself, I have never been treated as though I were invisible in my own future home. While a servant was shown courtesy, I have not been offered. Nobody contradicted the word servant, except that Thomas Reed, near the door, moved his gaze from the wall to the floor, which was not agreement, but was not nothing. And Mrs. Rowe's chin lifted by perhaps 1/4 of an inch, which, in a woman of her restraint, was the equivalent of standing on a chair and shouting. And Anna's eyes closed briefly in the expression of someone absorbing a blow they had been expecting. Lady Beatrice. Lucas stepped toward her, his voice controlled. This was manageable. He was good at managing. My mother has certain ways of... Your mother, Beatrice said, turning to him with a smile that was doing very hard work, has just bowed to a maid in front of the entire household staff. I think the household is entitled to wonder what that means. She glanced at Anna with an expression that was not quite contempt. It was too careful for contempt, but was the precise social cousin of it. And I think someone should explain how a maid comes to be treated as though she outranks the woman your family has agreed to welcome into it. Anna said nothing. Thomas and Mrs. Rowe exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, but carried the weight of a much longer conversation. Anna moved first. She took one quiet step toward the door and then another, and she would have made it into the corridor and disappeared in that particular way she had perfected over years of knowing exactly when she had become an inconvenience, except that Beatrice spoke. Where do you think you are going? It was not a loud question. Beatrice rarely needed volume. She had learned very early that a certain quality of stillness, combined with a certain quality of precision, was considerably more effective than volume. Anna stopped. I thought, Anna said, her voice steady in the way that voices are steady when steadiness is the result of long practice rather than ease. That I might take the cloak to thee. You will stay where you are, Beatrice said. We are not finished. A pause. Lady Beatrice, Augusta's voice, quiet and without warmth of any particular kind, moved through the room. She is not a chair. She does not remain where she is placed. Augusta crossed to Anna then, not quickly, but with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who intended every step to mean something. She placed one gloved hand briefly, gently, on Anna's wrist, just above where the cuff had been mended, and she looked at her with an expression that Lucas, watching from across the room, could not quite name. It was not maternal, exactly, or not only maternal. It was older than that. It was the look of a debt. You have been made invisible for too long, Augusta said quietly. Only Anna could have heard it clearly. That ends tonight. Anna looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes. Not gratitude, not yet. Something rawer than that. Something that looked like a person who had long since stopped expecting to be seen, suddenly having to reckon with the fact that someone was looking. She nodded once, barely. She did not move toward the door. Lucas's patience, which was considerable and professionally maintained, was beginning to develop structural problems. He stepped into the center of the room, with the decisive air of a man who has allowed a situation to proceed long enough and has arrived at the conclusion that it is now time to exercise authority over it. Mother, he said, in the tone he had last used during an agricultural dispute that had lasted 11 months and involved 6 different solicitors. I believe this evening has not begun as any of us intended. I suggest that Lady Beatrice be shown to her rooms, that we all take the time afforded by supper too. I am not tired, Augusta said. Mother, and I am not unwell. She looked at him steadily. I can see that you would prefer I were, because it would resolve your discomfort. But I am in full possession of my faculties, Lucas, and I would ask you to speak to me as though I am. The room was very quiet. Lucas felt, not for the first time in his life, the particular sensation of being outwitted by a woman who loved him and was not using it as a disadvantage. Then I don't understand, he said at last, and the honesty of it surprised even him, because it was not the diplomatic answer, and it was not the controlled answer. It was simply true. I don't understand what is happening. I know you don't, Augusta said without cruelty. The madness is not mine, Lucas. I'm asking you, I am asking all of you, to stay in this room long enough to understand that. Beatrice made a sound, just a small sound, barely anything, but in the silence of that drawing room it landed with precision. This is, she began, extraordinary, yes. Augusta agreed pleasantly. You mentioned. Now sit down, Lady Beatrice. Beatrice sat. It was, in retrospect, the most extraordinary thing that had happened all evening. The fire had burned lower. Nobody had moved to attend it. Thomas was watching it from the side of his eye, the way servants watched things they were too riveted to fix. Augusta remained standing, as she had for much of the evening, with the composed stillness of a woman who had no intention of being the first to tire. She looked at Beatrice. Beatrice had recovered her posture. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her smile was back in position, thinner now than it had been at the door, more deliberate, the smile of a woman who understood that she was in a room that was not behaving the way rooms were supposed to behave, and had decided that composure was her only remaining advantage. Lady Beatrice, Augusta said. Your Grace, you came to this house, Augusta said, with a woman in your service, a young woman who holds the cloaks and carries the cases, and keeps her eyes on the floor, and does not speak unless spoken to. A pause. I have been watching her since the door opened, and I have been watching you. Beatrice said nothing. She flinches, Augusta said, whenever you shift in your chair. Silence. She checked the door twice in this past hour, not to leave, to know where the exit was, the way a person does when they are accustomed to needing one. Augusta tilted her head slightly. Anna does not behave like a woman in ordinary service. She behaves like a woman who has learned to manage fear. Lucas looked at Anna. Anna was looking at the floor. Mother, Lucas said carefully, I think you may be. I would like you to explain something to me, Lady Beatrice. Augusta's voice did not rise. It did not need to. You have spoken of breeding, of comportment, of what is and is not appropriate behavior in a house such as this one. She let the silence hold for a moment. So tell me, since you value such things so precisely. Beatrice waited. Why, said the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, looking steadily at the woman her son intended to marry, does the maid tremble whenever you speak? Beatrice did not answer immediately. She was too practiced for that. A woman who answered difficult questions immediately was a woman who had not yet learned that the space before an answer was itself a kind of answer, and Beatrice had learned that particular lesson very young, and had never forgotten it. She let 3 full seconds pass. Then she unfolded her hands, smoothed the front of her gown with one precise gesture, and looked at Augusta with an expression of patient, almost sorrowful reasonableness. Your Grace, she said, I think what you are observing is simple timidity. Anna is a shy girl. She has always been shy. It is one of the reasons I retained her. She does not chatter. She does not complain. She is not underfoot. She is well suited to her position. A small, generous smile. I would not mistake quietness for fear. They are not the same thing. Augusta looked at her. No, Augusta agreed. They are not. She turned back to Anna. Anna was still standing near the edge of the room, still holding the cloak, though by now it had to be heavy. She had not been offered a chair. She had not been offered anything. She had been standing for the better part of an hour in a room where everyone else had eventually found a seat, and she was still upright, still contained, still doing the thing she always did, which was taking up as little space as possible and hoping it would be enough. Anna, Augusta said. Look at me. Anna looked up. Are you shy? Augusta asked, simply, directly. The way someone asked a question when they already knew the answer but wanted the other person to have the chance to give it. A pause. The fire shifted. A log dropped lower and sent up a small flare of light that moved across Anna's face and showed, for just a moment, the full exhaustion that lived there beneath the composure. I have learned, Anna said carefully, to be quiet. Yes, Augusta said. I imagine you have. Beatrice's smile thinned by a fraction. That is a very poetic way, she said, to describe a preference for silence. Your Grace, I wonder if we might. I find it descriptive rather than poetic, Augusta said, without looking away from Anna. There is a difference between a person who chooses silence and a person who has been taught that speaking costs them something. I have lived long enough to know which one I am looking at. Beatrice's jaw tightened. It was the smallest possible movement, and she controlled it almost immediately, but not quite immediately enough. Anna said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that saying nothing was the safest thing. She had learned it the way you learned anything that kept you safe, by discovering, once, what happened when you forgot. The door opened. Lord Edmund Marshall entered the drawing room with the ease of a man who treated other people's houses as extensions of his own, which was, in Anna's experience, exactly what he was. He was tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in the way that men who have always been given things tend to be handsome, comfortably, as though handsomeness were simply one more thing the world had sensibly provided for his convenience. Behind him came Lady Prudence Marshall, Beatrice's mother, in a gown of deep burgundy that had been selected, Anna suspected, with the specific intention of outranking every other woman in whatever room she entered. She looked at the drawing room with the satisfied assessment of a buyer inspecting a property she had already decided to acquire. Her eyes moved to Beatrice, then to Augusta, then briefly to Anna, with the particular quality of non-attention that people of a certain rank had perfected, the ability to register a servant's presence without allowing it to constitute actual acknowledgement. Then back to Augusta. Your Grace, Edmund Marshall's bow was correct and warm. He had a gift for warmth. Anna had noticed it over many months. He could deploy it the way other men deployed arguments. What a pleasure to arrive at last. The roads from the north were, well, we are here now. He looked at Lucas with the comfortable satisfaction of a man who considers himself a reasonable future father-in-law. Blackwood, you are looking well. Thank you, Lucas said, with the slight stiffness of a man who is not certain what is happening in his own home and is finding that uncertainty increasingly difficult to conceal. Lady Prudence moved to Beatrice's side and looked at her daughter's face and then at Augusta's face and performed, in the space of approximately 2 seconds, a rapid and expert assessment of the entire situation. We have arrived at an interesting moment, she said pleasantly. You have, Augusta agreed with equal pleasantness. Edmund looked between them with the smile of a man who has entered a room mid-conversation and is confident he can navigate it. Has there been some difficulty? These long arrivals can be. There has been a disagreement, Augusta said, about the nature of recognition. We were just discussing it. Edmund's smile remained in place. Anna watched him. She was very good at watching. She had spent years in a position where watching was the only intelligence gathering available to her, and she had become skilled at it, at reading the small adjustments people made when they were managing something rather than simply being somewhere. Edmund Marshall, she had observed, was always managing something. He looked at Anna now with the same non-attention his wife had offered. Then he looked at Augusta. Then he looked, with a slightly increased attention, at the dynamic of the room, at where everyone was standing, at Beatrice's compressed posture, at Lucas's controlled uncertainty. Lucas, Edmund said, with the easy authority of a man who has decided to take the situation in hand. Perhaps the Duchess needs some time to rest before supper. These reunions can be emotional. The Duchess, Augusta said, is standing directly in front of you and is in full possession of her hearing. Of course. Edmund adjusted seamlessly. I know what you meant, Augusta said. And something crossed Edmund Marshall's face then, too fast, too controlled, gone before it could be properly read. But Anna had been watching, and she caught it. It was not offense, it was caution. Augusta turned to Mrs. Rowe. The housekeeper had remained near the far edge of the room throughout all of this, occupying the specific position of a senior servant who understood that she was witnessing something important and had made the professional decision to be absolutely present for it without appearing to be. Mrs. Rowe, Augusta said, you have managed this household for 11 years. 12. Your Grace, 12. A small nod of acknowledgement. In that time, you have overseen every member of the household staff. You know their work. You know their conduct. I do, Your Grace. Has Anna Whitmore given you any cause for complaint? The question landed in the room like a stone into still water, and everyone watched the ring spread outward. Beatrice went very still. Mrs. Rowe did not hesitate. This was not because she was without caution. Helena Rowe had survived 12 years in a great house precisely because she was never without caution. But there were questions that did not leave room for caution, without becoming a kind of lie, and this was one of them. No, Your Grace, she said. She has been attentive, reliable, honest in her dealings with the household. She has been all of those things, Mrs. Rowe said. She is, in my observation, one of the most conscientious members of any staff I have managed. And has she ever caused disruption, sought attention, behaved in any way that might suggest she was? How was it put? Augusta glanced briefly at Beatrice. Playing tricks, Mrs. Rowe's expression did not change. She was very good at that. No, Your Grace, she said. In my experience, Anna has served without complaint, even when the conditions of that service were. She paused, a precise pause, the pause of a woman choosing her next word carefully, not because she was uncertain of it, but because she was certain of it and was deciding how directly to use it. more demanding than was customary. The room received this. Lucas looked at Mrs. Rowe with a slight sharpening of attention. He was, Anna had observed, a man who respected competence, and Helena Rowe was nothing if not competent. When she spoke in that particular measured tone, he listened. Lady Prudence said lightly, "Housekeepers naturally form attachments to the staff under their care. It is admirable, but not always objective." Mrs. Rowe looked at Lady Prudence. "I have been objective for 12 years," she said with great pleasantness. "I find it serves better than the alternative." Lady Celine March, who had been sitting near the window in the way that attractive young women sometimes sat near windows at social events, decoratively, and with the air of someone who had not yet found an opportunity to say something memorable, chose this moment to find one. "I must say," she offered, with a light laugh that she aimed at Beatrice as an offering of solidarity, "it is a curious evening, though I suppose servants do become attached to houses over time. One can almost understand the confusion." She looked at Anna with the pleasant vacancy of someone observing an interesting object in a shop they do not intend to enter. Though perhaps, if the girl dressed with a little more intention, these misunderstandings might be avoided. A few people produced small sounds of social agreement. Near the doorway, Elsie Hart made no sound at all. Elsie was 17 years old, and she had been a maid at Blackwood Hall for 8 months, and she had attached herself to Anna in the way that young people sometimes attached themselves to those who showed them, without fanfare and without demanding anything in return, that they were worth treating kindly. Anna had given up her own supper on a night when Elsie had worked until her hands shook and had missed the servant's meal. She had given it without comment, without ceremony, was sliding the plate across the table and returning to her mending as though it were simply the obvious thing to do, which to Anna it apparently was. Elsie had not forgotten this. She stood now with her hands clasped and her face arranged into the professional blankness required of her station, but her eyes were bright, with the specific brightness that came just before tears that a person was refusing to produce. Anna did not look at her. Anna had looked instead at the window behind Lady Celine's head, which was a technique she had developed over time, finding a fixed, neutral point and maintaining her gaze there, while whatever was being said about her was said, so that her face would not have to manage it in real time. Her face managed it anyway, a little. Not much. Just enough that Augusta, who was watching, saw it. "Anna." Beatrice's voice was precise and cool, the voice she used when she had decided that pleasantness had failed and efficiency was required. "I think," she said, standing now, the ivory silk of her gown catching the firelight, "that you owe this family an apology." Anna looked at her. "You have caused a scene," Beatrice said. "Whether intentionally or through some foolish misunderstanding, you have stood in this room and allowed yourself to become the subject of a conversation that has embarrassed your employer, embarrassed our hosts, and embarrassed the Duke, who was good enough to permit you to travel in the same party." Her voice remained steady. She was very good at righteous steadiness. "I think the appropriate thing, the decent thing, would be to acknowledge that, and to apologize to the room." Silence. Then Anna moved. It was a small movement, a lowering, a shift of weight, the beginning, unmistakably, of a kneel. Not from conviction, from something older than conviction, from the long habit of lowering yourself before the word sorry had even formed properly in your mind, because the expectation of lowering had been built into you so thoroughly that your body sometimes began before your mind had finished deciding. She was perhaps a quarter of the way down. Augusta crossed the room in 6 steps, which for a woman of her age and dignity was something close to swift. She placed herself between Anna and the floor, not physically, but in every sense that mattered, and she put one hand, firm and unhesitating, on Anna's arm, and she brought her back upright before her knees touched the carpet. "No," Augusta said quietly, "not to the room, to Anna." Anna straightened. Her face was very controlled. It was the face of a person who was not going to cry in this room, in front of these people, and had made that decision with a completeness that did not leave room for negotiation. "No one in this house," Augusta said, still quietly, still only to Anna, "will kneel to that." Beatrice's composure developed for the first time that evening, a visible crack. "Your Grace," she said, and the pleasantness in her voice had been replaced by something that was not quite anger, but was in the same neighborhood and heading in that direction. The woman is a servant. She is employed by my family. I am telling you that she owes an apology for what she owes," Augusta said, turning to face Beatrice fully, "is not something you are in a position to collect." Peter Moss had not intended to speak. He was the coachman which placed him in the established social cartography of Blackwood Hall, at a considerable distance from drawing-room conversations. He had been summoned to bring the luggage accounting to Mrs. Rowe and had been waiting near the corridor door for several minutes, which time he had tried with some difficulty to be invisible in the way that large weathered men who smelled faintly of horse were rarely quite able to be. He had the solid, uncomplicated face of a man who thought about horses more than politics, and did not consider this a deficiency. He was honest the way people who spent their lives with animals were often honest, because animals made insincerity expensive. He looked at what was happening in the room. He looked at Anna, standing with Augusta's hand still resting near her arm, her chin up, her face controlled. He looked at Beatrice, composed and sharp and waiting. He made a decision of the kind that uncomplicated, honest men made when they had seen something they had not been able to stop and were offered, unexpectedly, a chance to say so. "Beg pardon," he said. Several heads turned. "Peter." Mrs. Rowe's voice was a degree of careful. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, which was technically untrue, but was at least politely framed. He addressed himself to Augusta, because she seemed the correct person to address. "Your Grace, I drove the party down from the north 3 days." Augusta waited. "The young woman there." He nodded toward Anna. "She rode outside, on the box. Last 2 days. Weather was cold enough that I was half frozen on the driver's seat by the second morning, and I was dressed for it." He paused. "She wasn't." The room received this in silence. "She was also carrying the heavier trunks herself," he continued, with the methodical quality of a man giving a factual account and not embroidering it. "Both mornings. I offered to have the footman do it," she said. He glanced briefly at Beatrice. "She said she'd been told to do it herself." Lucas said nothing. He was looking at Anna. Anna was looking at the floor, not in the way she looked at the floor when she was avoiding something, in the way she looked at it when she was enduring something, and had decided that the floor was the safest place for her eyes while she did. "That will be all, Peter," Mrs. Rowe said, with the tone that closed conversations. "Yes, ma'am." He withdrew. The silence he left behind was a different quality of silence than the one before he had spoken. It happened quickly. In retrospect, Lucas would understand that it was the accumulation, the silence after Peter's account, the still visible compression of Augusta's hand near Anna's arm, the way the room had rearranged itself around a truth that nobody had named yet but everyone was beginning to feel, that caused Beatrice to miscalculate. She moved toward Anna, not aggressively, not obviously, with the smooth, social confidence of a woman crossing a room to address editor that she intended to close quietly and permanently. She reached out, as though to redirect, as though to straighten, some gesture that would look like correction from across the room, but would be something else from close up. Her fingers caught at Anna's collar. Not hard, not viciously, but with the careless authority of a woman accustomed to treating another person's clothing as furniture she was permitted to adjust. The collar shifted, and the locket moved. It swung forward on its chain, small, gold, old, the kind of thing that was not expensive by the standards of this room, but had been worn close to the skin for so long that it had taken on a different kind of value, the value of the irreplaceable. Beatrice went still. She had seen it before. Anna knew she had seen it before. Beatrice had seen it many times over the months and had never looked at it directly, had always looked slightly past it, in the way you looked past things that made you uncomfortable. But now the room had seen it. Augusta had seen it. Augusta crossed to them. The measured pace was gone. She walked with the swift directness of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment and has just recognized it. She did not touch the locket. She looked at it. For a long time she looked at it, and the expression on her face moved through several things in rapid succession. Recognition, a sharp and sudden grief, and then something that settled into a kind of shaken, grateful certainty. She looked up at Anna. Anna met her eyes. She did not know, yet, what the Dowager Duchess knew. She did not know what she was on the edge of, but she felt the quality of Augusta's attention, the way you felt the change in air before a storm. Not the thing itself yet, but the undeniable sense that something large was very close. "Where did you get this?" Augusta asked. Her voice, for the first time all evening, was not steady. "It was my mother's," Anna said. "It is the only thing of hers I kept." Augusta looked at the locket for another long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. Not with tears exactly, with something that had been waiting inside them for a long time. "What was your mother's name?" Augusta asked, a beat. Then, quietly, carefully, "The way you said a name that had been both precious and painful for as long as you could remember," Anna answered. "Marianne," she said. Her name was Marianne. Augusta's breath left her in one slow, controlled measure. "That locket," she said, and her voice was very quiet now, and very precise, and aimed at the whole room, but most particularly at Beatrice Marshall, who had gone the color of old wax. "Belonged to Lady Marianne Whitmore." She looked at Anna. "Tell me, child," she said it gently, "the way you said something gentle when the truth behind it was going to cost someone a great deal. Who was your mother?" Anna did not answer immediately, not because she did not know the answer. She had always known the answer, or the pieces of it, the name, the locket, the stories told in low voices by women who had known her mother briefly, and then disappeared from her life, one by one as the years moved her further from everything that had once been familiar. She did not answer immediately, because she had learned, over a long time, that the truth about her mother was not a thing the world received well. She had offered it twice in her life, once to a woman who had taken her in after Marianne died, and once to a solicitor she had found 3 years later with money saved from 6 months of wages. And both times it had been returned to her like something counterfeit. Politely, carefully, but with finality, she had stopped offering it after that. So she stood now in the drawing room of Blackwood Hall, with Augusta's eyes on her face, and the locket still swinging gently on its chain. And she took a breath, and she said what she had not said aloud in a very long time. "I was told her name carried shame," Anna said. "I was told that she had disgraced herself, that her connections were severed, that the name Whitmore was better forgotten." She paused. "I was told this by the woman who took me in after she died. I believed it for a long time." Another pause, shorter. "I am not sure I believe it anymore." Augusta had not moved. She was watching Anna with an expression that had passed through grief and arrived somewhere else, somewhere older and harder and more complicated than grief, the expression of someone reckoning not with a loss, but with what they had permitted. "Lady Marianne Whitmore," Augusta said, and she said the full name with a deliberateness that made it sound like a restoration, like something being placed back on a shelf it had been taken from without permission. Was not a woman of shame. She was a woman of more honor than most people in this room will encounter in their lifetimes. She stopped. "She was also my dearest friend." Anna looked at her. Augusta looked back. Between them, in the silence, something shifted that could not be unshifted. She never told me she had a daughter placed in service, Augusta said. And the quietness of it was not peaceful, but the particular quiet of someone confronting a failure. She never told me because she was dead before I thought to ask. Many poor women, Beatrice said, invent grand names. She said it lightly, almost conversationally, with the confident ease of someone throwing water on a fire that they are certain will go out. It did not go out. The words landed in the room and did not disperse. They sat there in the air, visible and countable, and several people looked at them and then looked at Beatrice with varying degrees of expression. Augusta, with something cold and measuring Mrs. Rowe with the blank professionalism that had begun to operate, in Anna's observation, as a mask for something considerably less neutral, and Lucas with a new quality of attention that he turned on Beatrice slowly, as though he were only now beginning to look at her clearly, and was not certain he recognized what he was seeing. Beatrice noticed. That was the thing about Beatrice Marshall that Anna had learned over months of proximity. She was not careless. She watched rooms. She read faces. She understood the moment when she had miscalculated and moved instantly and smoothly to recover. I only mean, Beatrice said with a small, reasonable smile, that identity is a serious matter. We cannot simply accept, with the best will in the world, the claim of a servant girl that she is the daughter of a noblewoman on the basis of a locket and a Christian name. She spread her hands in a gesture of measured openness. Surely the Duchess herself would agree that a claim of this kind requires verification. It requires exactly that, Augusta said, with a cordiality that was entirely without warmth. Which is why we will have it. Beatrice's smile held, but Lucas was still looking at her. And Anna, who had stood in rooms with Beatrice Marshall for the better part of a year, who had learned to read the small mechanical adjustments Beatrice made when she was managing rather than merely speaking, saw what Lucas was only beginning to see. Beatrice was not skeptical, she was afraid. The speech about verification and identity and poor women inventing names had not come from doubt. It had come from somewhere that doubt did not live. From the particular place where people kept the things they needed other people not to find. Anna had spent a year wondering why Beatrice had kept her close rather than dismissing her when the situation had grown complicated. She had told herself it was habit or convenience or the simple cruelty of wanting to look at something you had diminished. She understood now, standing in this room, watching Beatrice's controlled and frightened face, that she had been kept close because Beatrice needed to know where she was. You did not keep track of things that did not matter. Mrs. Rowe, Augusta said, turning with the brisk decision of someone who has finished waiting and begun acting, please send for Mr. Fenwick. Mrs. Rowe nodded once and moved toward the door with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to executing instructions without requiring them to be explained. Mr. Fenwick, Lucas said. Your father's solicitor, Augusta said, and before that his father's. He is staying in the East Wing. I asked him here 3 days ago. She looked at Lucas steadily. Before you arrived, before any of this. She let that sit for a moment. I had reasons of my own for wanting him present. Lord Edmund moved from his position near the fireplace. Augusta. He used her given name with the familiarity of long acquaintance, which was, Anna observed, a strategic choice. It positioned him as an intimate rather than an opponent, as someone concerned rather than implicated. Surely, whatever questions have arisen tonight can be addressed in the morning, when everyone has rested and the situation can be approached with clarity. I am quite clear now, Augusta said. The girl has had a long journey, Edmund said pleasantly. We all have, perhaps. The girl, Anna said, and her own voice surprised her slightly with its steadiness, has had a long several years. A night's difference seems unlikely to change anything material. Edmund looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since he had entered the room. In the months she had spent in the Marshall household, Edmund Marshall had managed, with the practiced ease of a man for whom it was second nature, to look past her with reliable consistency. She was furniture to him, useful, positioned, and essentially without interiority. He looked at her now, and she watched him assess the situation. The room, Augusta, the locket, the fact of her speaking, the words themselves. And she watched him decide, in the space of a moment, that caution was required. "Of course," he said, withdrawing the suggestion with a smooth generosity that made it look like accommodation rather than retreat. "Whatever the Duchess thinks best." The door opened. Mr. Nathaniel Fenwick entered the drawing room. He was a small man, precise in the way that men who spent their lives managing other people's most consequential documents tended to be precise. His dark suit was immaculate. His spectacles were settled on his nose with the comfortable permanence of something that had been in exactly that position for 40 years. He carried a leather document case that was old and well worn, the case of a man who trusted what was inside it more than he trusted most things in the world. He looked at the room. He took its measure with the quiet efficiency of a man who read situations professionally. Then he looked at Anna. Something crossed his face, brief, controlled, the movement of a man who has been carrying information for a long time and has just entered the room where it is about to become relevant. "Your Grace," he said to Augusta with a bow of precise depth. "Thank you for coming, Nathaniel," Augusta said. "I believe the time has come." He nodded. He had, it appeared, been expecting this. He opened the case. The letter was sealed. Not with the casual wax of ordinary correspondence, the kind that was pressed quickly, without ceremony, and was broken without consequence. This seal had been applied with intention. The wax was deep red, the impression clear, and it carried two marks side by side, the crest of the Blackwood family, and beneath it the smaller mark of the Whitmore estate. Fenwick held it for a moment before he spoke. "This letter," he said in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who understood that what he was about to say would land differently depending on how it was delivered, was composed by the late Duke of Blackwood, Harold Blackwood, in the winter of 1809. It was given into my keeping with specific instructions that it was not to be opened until such time as it became necessary. He looked at Augusta. "Her Grace contacted me a fortnight ago," he said. She had reason to believe that time had come. Lucas looked at his mother. "A fortnight ago. What reason?" "I had been looking for a long time," Augusta said simply. "And I had begun to find things." Fenwick broke the seal with the small, careful knife he produced from his inner pocket. The wax gave cleanly, as though it had been waiting. He unfolded the letter. He read it to himself first, a brief pass of the eyes, the review of a man confirming that the document said what he remembered, and then he read it aloud. The late Duke's words were not elaborate. Harold Blackwood had been, by all accounts, a man who said what he meant without decoration, and the letter reflected this. It described, in plain and unambiguous terms, a debt. Lady Marianne Whitmore had, in the autumn of 1807, pulled a 12-year-old Lucas Blackwood from the path of a carriage that had lost its horses on the North Road. She had moved him to St. and had taken the impact herself. She had recovered eventually, but not entirely. Her health had been diminished in ways that accumulated over the following years. The late Duke had visited her in the final months of her life. He had made her a promise, witnessed by Fenwick, and recorded in a separate document that Fenwick now produced from the case. The promise was this, that her daughter, Anna, would always be received as a ward of the Blackwood family, that her name would be protected, that her inheritance, the Whitmore estate and its remaining income, would be preserved for her, managed honestly, and delivered to her when she came of age. Lucas sat very still. He was 31 years old. He had been 12 when a woman on the North Road had put herself between him and a runaway carriage. He did not remember it clearly. There had been noise and movement, and then a long period of unconsciousness followed by weeks of recovery. But he had been told the broad facts. He had never been told her name. He had never been told she had a daughter. He looked at Anna. Anna was looking at the letter in Fenwick's hands, with the expression of a person who is hearing a version of their own life that is recognizable in its architecture, but has been furnished entirely differently than the version they were given. He promised, Lucas said. His voice was different than it had been. Something had gone out of it. My father promised. He did, Fenwick said. And the estate? Fenwick did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. Dr. Lionel Ashe had been located in the village 3 hours before any of this had begun, because Augusta had sent for him in the morning, before Lucas's party arrived, with the same quiet foresight with which she had summoned Fenwick. He was a large man, gone soft with age, with the gentle, deliberate movements of someone who had spent a lifetime entering rooms where people were frightened, and had learned to bring calm in with him as a matter of professional habit. He looked at Anna with the careful, non-invasive attention of a physician. I attended Lady Marianne Whitmore in the final 2 years of her life, he said, addressing the room but looking at Anna. I was present at her death. I was also present, eight years before that, at the birth of her daughter. He paused. The child had a crescent-shaped scar on her left forearm, from a burn she sustained as an infant. It was distinctive, the kind of thing a physician does not forget. He looked at Anna's left arm. Anna, after a moment, turned back her cuff. The scar was there, small, pale, crescent-shaped, exactly as described. The room looked at it. Dr. Ashe nodded once, with the quiet satisfaction of a man confirming what he already knew. Lady Marianne gave me a locket on the night she died, he said. She asked me to give it to her daughter, if I ever found her. She told me the locket had belonged to her own mother, and to her mother before that, and that she should not be lost. He looked at the locket at Anna's throat. I gave it to the woman who said she would deliver it. I have spent a long time wondering if it arrived. It arrived, Anna said. Her voice was very quiet. It was left on a doorstep with my name on a piece of paper. I was 8 years old. I thought for a long time that my mother had left it herself. That she was still. She stopped. Ashe looked at her with the particular sorrow of someone who had delivered difficult information to people all his life and had never found it easy. She spoke of you, he said. In her final hours, she was very clear. She said, he glanced at the room, then back at Anna, making the private decision to offer this part directly to her and not to the audience. She said that you were the most important thing she had ever done, that you were to be proud of your name. A pause. She did not know at the end that you had already been separated from it. Anna did not cry. She had made herself a promise years ago about crying in front of people who had not earned it. But her hand moved, briefly and involuntarily, to the locket at her throat, and she held it there for a moment, with a grip that was not composed and was not performing anything for anyone. Augusta watched her. Augusta, who had been composed all evening, with the controlled authority of a woman who had decided what this night would be, looked at Anna, holding the locket, and for just a moment the composure cost her something visible. Lord Edmund Marshall had been very quiet for several minutes. This was unusual. Edmund Marshall was rarely quiet. Quiet was what other people were, while he shaped a situation. And he was very good at shaping situations. He had built a career and a social position on it. Anna had come to understand, over the months of living at its edge, built several other things on it as well. He was quiet now because he was calculating. Anna could see it. She had been watching him for a long time, and she knew the difference between his comfortable silences and his working ones. And this was a working one, fast and precise, running the mathematics of the room. Fenwick gave him no more time for mathematics. There is a further document, Fenwick said, producing it from the case with the same careful, unhurried motion he gave to everything. This was not left in my keeping by the late Duke. He looked at Edmund. Edmund met his gaze with excellent composure. "It is a deed of transfer," Fenwick said, "executed in 1811, 2 years after the late Duke's letter, and 1 year after Lady Marianne's death. It transfers guardianship of the Whitmore estate accounts from the Blackwood family's designated management to a private trustee." He paused. "The trustee is Lord Edmund Marshall." Silence. "That transfer," Fenwick continued, with the measured pace of a man who understood that what he was saying was serious and did not intend to say it too quickly or too slowly, "was executed without the knowledge of the Dowager Duchess. It bears 2 signatures, Lord Marshall's, and a second signature from a clerk in my former office, who was dismissed 3 months after this document was dated, for reasons that were described at the time as administrative, and which I have more recently had cause to review," Edmund said, with impressive steadiness. "Documents of that period were frequently the Whitmore state income," Fenwick said, as though Edmund had not spoken, "was redirected over a period of several years. It did not go to Anna Whitmore. It was absorbed into accounts held under the Marshall family name." He looked at Fenwick's letter, then at Edmund. "A portion of it appears, in the accounting I have been able to reconstruct, to have contributed to Lady Beatrice's dowry." The room went very still. Lucas said nothing. He was looking at Edmund Marshall with the expression of a man who has been told that the foundation of a building he has been standing in comfortably is not what he believed it to be, and is still deciding whether the building is going to fall. Lady Prudence, who had been perfectly composed throughout everything, reached out and placed her hand on Beatrice's arm. Beatrice did not look at her mother. Beatrice was looking at the document in Fenwick's hands, with the expression of a woman watching something she had hoped would remain buried continue, with terrible patience to surface. "Why did nobody come for me?" Anna had not planned to say it. It was not the kind of thing she planned. It was the kind of thing that existed below planning, in the part of a person that years of management and discipline and learned invisibility could compress but could not entirely erase. She said it to the room, but she said it looking at Augusta. Augusta looked back at her. "I looked," Augusta said. It came out without the polished authority of everything else she had said that evening. It came out plainly, in the way that things came out when they had been held inside for a long time, and were finally released without preparation. "After Marianne died, after I learned, late, too late, that she was gone, I looked for her daughter. I was told—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. "I was told that the child had died, that she had not survived the winter after her mother." Anna absorbed this. "Someone told you I was dead," she said. "Yes, and you believed it." "I did not want to believe it," Augusta said. "I made inquiries, 3 separate inquiries. They all returned the same answer." Her voice was controlled, but the control was costing her something now, and it showed. "I believed it because the alternative, that she was alive and I had failed to find her, was not something I could manage at the time. I had recently lost my husband. I was managing this house, my son, a dozen other obligations." She paused. "I am not offering those as justifications. I am offering them as an account. There is a difference." "Yes," Anna said with a faint and exhausted recognition. "There is." "I should have looked longer," Augusta said. "I should have refused the answer. I should have understood that information about a child's death, offered conveniently and without documentation, by people who had reason to prefer that the child be dead." She stopped again. "I should have been more suspicious. I was not. And you suffered for my failure as much as for anyone else's deliberate cruelty." She did not look away from Anna. "I am sorry. I have wanted to say that since before you arrived in this room. It is inadequate. It is all I have." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the corridor the clock ticked its patient, indifferent tick. Anna looked at the woman who had curtsied to her in a room full of people, who had stood between her and a floor she had been ordered to kneel on, who had sent for a solicitor and a physician and the evidence of a broken promise. who had said, "I should have looked longer," with the particular grief of someone who had been living inside that sentence for years. She did not forgive her, not yet. Forgiveness was not a thing that arrived in an evening, in a single conversation, however honest. She had learned that in the hard, specific way that people learn things that cost them. But she looked at Augusta and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the unfamiliar and somewhat frightening sensation of being seen by someone who was not going to look away. "You said," Anna said quietly, "that you believed I was dead, that someone told you and you believed it." She paused. "Who told you?" Augusta's eyes moved briefly and with complete control to Edmund Marshall. She did not say his name. She did not need to. Fenwick said it for her, without looking up from the document in his hands. "The answer," he said, his voice carrying the dry, careful authority of a man who dealt only in what could be proven, "is in the same correspondence as the guardianship transfer. The information about the child's death was communicated in a letter. The letter was signed." He set the document on the table beside him with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial. "The paper does not tremble, my lord." He looked at Edmund Marshall over the rims of his spectacles. "Only the guilty do." Edmund Marshall said nothing, and in the silence that followed, Beatrice looked at her father, and something moved between them. A glance, brief and charged. The private communication of two people who share a secret that is no longer private. And Lucas saw it, and this time he did not look away. Supper had been laid in the dining room at 7. It was now nearly 9, and the candles had burned a third of the way down, and the soup had been cleared unfed, and the footman stationed at the sideboard had developed the particular professional stillness of people managing a situation that was considerably outside the standard parameters of their employment. Augusta had made the decision about the dining room arrangement herself. She had communicated it to Mrs. Rowe in 2 sentences, and Mrs. Rowe had communicated it to Thomas, and Thomas had reset the table with the expression of a man who understood that what he was being asked to do was not a mistake and was not negotiable, and who therefore did it without comment. Anna sat at the table, not at the far end, not at a remove. She sat 3 places from Augusta, which placed her among the guests, which placed her, and this was not lost on anyone in the room, above the salt, and well within the candlelight, and entirely visible to everyone present. Lord Julian Harrow, who had arrived for dinner as a prearranged guest, and had walked into a situation he had not been prearranged for, sat across from her, with the bright, careful attention of a man who had built his social reputation on being present at important moments and knew, with the instinct of long practice, that he was present at one now. Lady Celine March sat beside Beatrice, and had been beside Beatrice all evening in the way that small animals stayed close to larger ones when the weather changed. Beatrice sat at the table. She had not refused. Refusing would have been a statement, and statements could be quoted and repeated. And Beatrice Marshall understood that rooms like this one, with guests like Lord Harrow in them, were rooms where everything said had a second life in a dozen other dining rooms within a fortnight. She had chosen the strategy of composure and presence, and she was executing it with the exhausting precision of someone who had decided that the best defense was the performance of someone who had nothing to defend. Her eyes moved to Anna once, then away. She picked up her wineglass and held it with the perfect ease of a woman who was not holding it too tightly. Augusta waited until the first course had been served. She had learned, over 50 years of managing important conversations, that the right moment to introduce an irreversible element was not at the beginning, when people were still arriving at their positions, and not at the end, when they had fortified themselves. It was in the middle, when they were settled enough to hear it and not yet defended enough to avoid it. "Lord Harrow," she said pleasantly, from her end of the table, "you have been patient this evening." Harrow set down his fork with the attentive speed of a man who had been waiting to be addressed. Not at all, Your Grace. The company has been illuminating. It has, Augusta agreed. I hope you will forgive the irregularity of the arrangements. There is nothing to forgive, he glanced, with the impeccable social timing of a practiced observer at Anna. I confess I have been curious about the placement. Miss Whitmore, Augusta said, is my guest. The table received the name, the title, the full formal construction of it. Miss Whitmore, not Anna, not the girl, not she. And everyone at the table understood that something had changed in the architecture of the evening, that a line had been drawn, and they were now all sitting on one side of it or the other. Beatrice set her wine glass down. I wonder, she said, with extraordinary control, if this is the appropriate setting for. I will not sit at table with her. She had not meant to say it that directly. Anna could see it, the slight widening of Beatrice's own eyes after the words were out, the fractional recognition that composure had briefly lost its footing. But the words were said, and they were in the room now, and Lord Harrow was already very still in the particular way of a man committing something to memory. Augusta looked at Beatrice. Then you will be hungry, Augusta said, pleasantly. With complete finality, Beatrice did not stand. She picked up her fork, and she looked at her plate, and she said nothing further. And the effort of that nothing was visible to Anna in the precise rigidity of her shoulders, and the angle of her jaw, and the way her eyes, when they moved everywhere in the room, except to the three people she most needed not to look at. Edmund Marshall, across the table, was watching his daughter, with the expression of a man recalculating. Miss Nora Bell arrived during the fish course. She had not been invited to dinner. She was a seamstress from the village, who had driven herself to Blackwood Hall in a borrowed cart in the rain, because she had received a message, delivered by Thomas Reed, who had ridden to the village that afternoon on an errand Mrs. Rowe had quietly authorized, telling her that her presence and her account books would be welcome at the hall this evening. She was a small, precise woman who smelled faintly of lavender and chalk, and carried a leather ledger under her arm with the possessiveness of someone transporting evidence. Thomas brought her to the door of the dining room. She looked at the assembled dinner party with the unintimidated practicality of a woman who had spent 30 years fitting gowns for the wealthy and had long since ceased to find them impressive. Your Grace, she said, with a nod to Augusta. Miss Bell, Augusta said. Thank you for coming. I believe you have something for us. I have several things, Nora Bell said. She opened the ledger on the sideboard with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had not driven through rain to be indirect about it. I have outstanding accounts for work delivered to the Marshall household over the past 14 months. Work that was completed, delivered, and accepted. She ran a finger down a column, and not paid for. Lord Harrow put down his fork again. Lady Selene had stopped pretending to eat some minutes ago. There is additionally, Nora Bell continued, with the steady composure of a woman reading from a document that required no embellishment, the matter of a bolt of Flemish lace, valued at £4 10s, which was reported damaged and therefore non-payable. The damage was described to me by Lady Beatrice as the result of careless handling by the assistant who delivered the order. She looked up. Her gaze moved without apology to Anna. The assistant who delivered the order was Miss Whitmore. I have the delivery record in her hand. I also have a note written the same afternoon by my apprentice who witnessed the delivery. Miss Whitmore handled the lace correctly. The lace was intact upon delivery. A pause. The damage occurred afterward. I know this because I saw the lace myself when it was returned. The cut was clean. Not a tear, not wear, a cut. The dining room was very quiet. I did not speak at the time, Nora Bell said, because I could not afford to lose the account. I am speaking now because someone has asked me, and because Miss Whitmore was blamed for something she did not do, and I find I have less patience for silence than I once did. She closed the ledger. Lucas had not eaten anything in some time. Mrs. Rowe spoke from the doorway. She had not been seated at the table. She stood at the entrance to the dining room in the position of a senior servant who had been asked a question and had come to answer it. And she answered it with the same measured precision she had offered in the drawing room, factually, without embellishment, and with the specific gravity of someone who had been waiting for a legitimate occasion to say what she was saying. "Been housekeeper at Blackwood Hall for 12 years, she said. In that time I have seen many guests. I have managed many household arrangements. I have observed the treatment of this household staff by those guests, because the treatment of staff is, in my experience, the most accurate reflection of a person's character that exists. More accurate than their manners at table, more accurate than their conversation, more accurate than anything they choose to present when they believe they are being assessed." She looked at Lucas. He was watching her with the attentiveness he gave to people he respected. And Mrs. Rowe, who had managed his house since he was 19 years old, knew that look. "Lady Beatrice Marshall," she said, "informed Anna Whitmore, in my hearing and in the hearing of Thomas Reed, on the morning of the 3rd day of travel, that she intended to dismiss her from service without wages or reference following the wedding." She paused. The stated reason was that she did not wish to have, in her household, someone who, and I am repeating this exactly as it was said, someone who knew too much about her from before she was important. The table was absolutely silent. Someone who knew too much about her from before she was important. Lucas set down his fork. He looked at Beatrice. Beatrice was looking at the tablecloth. She had been looking at the tablecloth since approximately the middle of Mrs. Rowe's account, which was, Anna reflected, the most honest thing she had gained all evening, choosing, finally, something she could not argue with. Lucas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Anna. Anna looked back at him. She had been waiting, she realized. She had been waiting all evening. Through the drawing room and the Locket and Fenwick's documents, and the physician's testimony and Edmund's calculated silences, to see what Lucas Blackwood would do when he had run out of comfortable explanations, when the last door through which he might exit into ignorance had been closed. He looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived at a reckoning he had been traveling toward without knowing it, and had found it larger than he expected. He opened his mouth, then he closed it, and he looked away. Anna set her fork down beside her plate with a quietness that was not peace. She looked at the table, at the candles burning steadily in their silver holders, at the wine she had not drunk, at the untouched food that had been placed in front of her, with the same care given to every other guest, and which she had been too occupied to eat. And she thought about the years. Not all of them. She did not have the energy for all of them tonight. She thought about one specific year, the year she had been 17, when she had still been trying to reclaim her name through legitimate channels, when she had written letters that were not answered and visited offices where she was made to wait and wait and wait until it became clear that the waiting was itself the answer. She had stopped trying after that. She had taken a position, then another, then another. She had learned to be useful, because useful people were kept, and being kept was the closest thing to safe that she had found. She had ended up with Beatrice Marshall, who was cruel in private and polished in public, and who had known enough of the truth to keep Anna exactly where knowing her was useful and exactly where the world would not look at her. She looked at Lucas. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was level. It had the levelness of something that had been through enough to be done with trembling. "I would like to say something." He looked at her. "Your mother curtsied to me," Anna said. "She did it in front of your household, your guests, and the woman you intend to marry. She did it because she recognized something, and she had the courage to acknowledge it publicly and at personal cost." She paused. She has spent this evening producing witnesses, documents, and testimony. She has done it at the age at which most people of her position sit quietly and permit things to remain as they are. She glanced at Augusta, briefly, and then back at Lucas. Beatrice Marshall ordered me to ride outside in cold weather for 2 days, Anna said. She told your housekeeper she planned to dismiss me without wages after your wedding. She blamed me for damage she caused herself and allowed a woman's livelihood to suffer for it. She ordered me to kneel in your mother's drawing room and apologize to a room full of people for the crime of being recognized. She let that sit. I am telling you this not because you do not know it. You have heard all of it tonight. I am telling you because I want to understand something. He was very still. You have sat in this room, Anna said, and heard every word of it, and every time a door has opened. Every time there has been a moment when you might have said something, might have asked her to account for it, might have said even one word that acknowledged what has been described. You have looked at the table, or you have looked at her, or you have looked at me with an expression that I think is meant to be distress, but which, from where I am sitting, is very difficult to distinguish from convenience. The table was not breathing. Beatrice's cruelty wounded me, Anna said. I will not pretend it did not, but I have been wounded before. I know how to survive cruelty. She paused. The pause had weight. It is the silence of people who watched it and called it confusion that taught me I deserved it. Lucas looked at her. He looked at her the way people looked at something true that they had been hoping, until this moment was not quite as true as it appeared. He did not say anything. That, too, was an answer. Edmund Marshall stood. He did it with the smooth authority of a man who had decided that the moment had come to reshape the room, and who had done it before and knew how. I have listened, he said, with the generous patience of a man who had been wrongly put upon and was being gracious about it, to a great deal this evening. Documents of questionable provenance, testimony from servants and tradespeople, accusations that touch my family's name and my daughter's reputation. He looked at Lucas. I think you will understand, Blackwood, that I cannot permit this to continue without making certain matters clear. He reached inside his coat. The engagement between Lady Beatrice and the Duke of Blackwood represents an agreement between two families of standing. It represents months of legal arrangement, social understanding, and mutual investment. He set a folded document on the table. Should that engagement be prematurely terminated, there are consequences, legal ones, financial ones. He looked at Lucas with the comfortable confidence of a man who had navigated difficult rooms before. Consequences that would reflect, publicly and materially, on the Blackwood name. I am certain you understand that a scandal of this nature, at this stage, would. There will be a scandal, said a new voice from the doorway, regardless of what happens with the engagement. Magistrate Jonah Reeves stood in the entrance to the dining room. He was a compact, weather-faced man with the direct bearing of someone who held authority in rural counties, precisely because he did not require a room to already respect him before he entered it. He had ridden from the village at Augusta's request. Augusta's second request of the day, it emerged, the first having been Fenwick and the second Reeves, both summoned with the same quiet foresight and for related reasons. He looked at Edmund Marshall. I have read the documents Mr. Fenwick prepared, he said. The guardianship transfer, the correspondence regarding the child, the estate accounts. He paused. I am not in a position to adjudicate this tonight, Lord Marshal, but I am in a position to tell you that the matter will be investigated, formally, and that you would be well advised not to leave the county before that investigation has begun. Edmund's composure remained, but something left his eyes. It was the something that had allowed him, for 15 years, to sit in rooms like this one, and feel that the room would ultimately accommodate him. He had spent 15 years being the kind of man who moved through difficult situations and emerged from them with his position intact, because he understood how to manage information and how to manage people, and how to manage the gap between what had happened and what could be proven. He was beginning to understand now, looking at Reeves and at Fenwick's documents on the table and at Lucas's face, that the gap had closed. He sat down. Lady Prudence put her hand over Beatrice's on the tablecloth, and Beatrice let her. And it was the first moment all evening that Beatrice had looked like someone who might be afraid in exactly the way that ordinary people were afraid, not of scandal, not of position, but of what came next. Captain Miles Grey had not spoken since he arrived. He had come to dinner as an old friend of the late Duke's, expected, unremarkable, a familiar face at Blackwood Hall, who had been at table a dozen times, and who had spent the evening listening with the quiet attention of a man who had long since learned that the most useful thing in a complicated room was not to contribute to the complication. But he had heard Edmund Marshall's threat, and he had looked, when it was delivered, at Lucas, and he had seen what was on Lucas's face, and he had made the decision that men made when they had held something back long enough, and the room required them to stop. "Lucas," he said. Everyone looked at him. He had a voice that produced that. Not loud, but with the settled authority of a man who had spent his life being heard in difficult conditions. "You were 12, Miles Grey said. The North Road. Do you remember any of it?" Lucas looked at him. "Some of it. Not much." "I was there," Grey said. "I was riding behind the carriage. I saw what happened." He looked at his wineglass, then back at Lucas. "The horses went in the ditch, and the carriage came across the road. You were on the verge. You'd climbed out on the step. You would have been directly in the path of it." He paused. "A woman came out of nowhere. She was walking the road, just walking, carrying a market basket. She dropped everything, and she ran, and she pulled you clear." He was quiet for a moment. "She was not a small woman, and you were not a small 12-year-old, and the carriage came very close. She took the edge of it, left side. She never said a word about it, not to me, not, as I understand it, to anyone." He looked at Anna. "She had dark hair," he said. "She had the same quality about her that you have. The stillness, the kind of stillness that is not emptiness." He paused. "I have wondered, every year since Marianne died, what became of her daughter. I was told the child was gone." He looked at Edmund Marshall. "I know now who told that story and why." Lucas was looking at Anna, not with the careful managed attention he had deployed all evening, not with the distress that had been indistinguishable from convenience, with something simpler and more exposed than either of those things. The look of a man who has understood something that has rearranged the interior of the last 20 years. He had spent his entire adult life not knowing that he owed it. He understood now. He looked across the table at Beatrice, at the woman he had chosen with pride and presented with pride and defended. Not very well, not very loudly, but defended in the way of a man who preferred not to look too closely at the thing he was defending, because looking closely was expensive. Beatrice met his eyes. She knew. She had known all evening that this moment was coming. That was the thing about Beatrice Marshall. She was not stupid, and she was not without self-knowledge, and she had spent the entire evening watching the ground give way beneath her, with the specific dread of someone who has known, always, that the ground was borrowed. Lucas looked away from her. He looked at Anna, who had placed her hands flat on the table in front of her, and was looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone who has said what needed to be said, and is now waiting to see what the world does with it. Then Anna reached up, unclasped the locket from her throat, and placed it on the table. She set it down carefully, exactly in front of her, and she looked at it for a moment, at the small gold thing that had held, through every displacement and every year of invisibility, the only proof she had that she had once been someone's most important thing. Then she looked at the room. "I have never asked this family for anything," she said. Her voice was very quiet and absolutely steady, in the way that voices were steady when the person using them had arrived somewhere beyond the reach of further wound. I did not ask for recognition. I did not ask for restoration. I did not come to this house with a claim. She looked at Augusta, then at Lucas, then at no one in particular. I came to this house carrying a cloak. That was all I came with. That was all I was given to come with. She pushed her chair back. She stood. I will not start asking now, she said, and she walked out. The corridor outside the dining room was cold. Not bitterly so. The fires had been laid throughout the ground floor in preparation for a dinner that had not proceeded as planned, but cold in the way of old stone houses in early spring, where warmth was always provisional, always something that had to be maintained against the persistent memory of winter that lived in the walls. Anna walked without a destination. This was not unusual for her. She had spent years moving through spaces that did not belong to her, and she had learned that the appearance of purpose was more important than its presence. You walked as though you knew where you were going, and people did not stop you. You kept your eyes forward and your shoulders level, and you did not look at doors that were not yours to open. She had made it to the far end of the corridor, where a window looked out onto the winter garden, bare-branched and silver in the moonlight, before she heard the footsteps behind her. She did not turn. She knew the sound of them. She had spent enough time in houses to know the sound of different people's footsteps, their weight, their pace, the thing they communicated about the person's state of mind. These footsteps were not the measured, deliberate steps of Augusta, or the efficient purposefulness of Mrs. Rowe. They were faster than they usually were, and less controlled, and they were the footsteps of someone who had made a decision in a hurry, and was moving before the decision could be reconsidered. Lucas stopped a few feet behind her. She looked at the garden. "Anna," he said, "Your Grace, I want to." He stopped. Started again. "I owe you." He stopped again. He was, she understood, a man who was accustomed to having the right words, who had been educated and trained and socially formed in rooms where the right words were always available, and who had arrived at a moment where none of them were adequate and was struggling with that inadequacy in real time. She turned. She looked at him in the dim light of the corridor. This man who had stood in drawing rooms and dining rooms all evening while her life was being unwrapped in front of him, who had listened and hesitated and found reasons not to speak, who had looked at her with distress that was indistinguishable from convenience, until Miles Gray had told him what his life had cost someone else. "I know," Lucas said at last. "I know that nothing I say." "I don't want reassurance," Anna said quietly. "I have had a great deal of reassurance in my life. It has generally arrived precisely as late as yours has, and carried about the same weight." He looked at her. "What do you want?" he asked. And it was, she thought, perhaps the first honest question he had asked all evening. Asked without strategy, without management, without the slight performance that powerful men gave to sincerity when they needed it to function as a social tool. She looked at him for a long moment. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Not for my sake. I have stopped asking for things on my own behalf. For yours." She paused. Beatrice's cruelty was straightforward. It had a logic. She needed me small and silent and within reach because I was a problem she had decided to manage rather than address. Anna looked at the dark garden. I could map every cruelty she offered me onto a reason. It did not make it less painful, but it was comprehensible. She looked back at him. "You were different," she said. "You were not cruel to me. You were, when we occupied the same room, correct and civil and entirely absent. You looked at me the way you looked at the furniture, necessary, functional, not requiring acknowledgement." She said it without anger. Anger would have required more energy than she had left, and besides, it was not anger she felt. It was something quieter and more durable than anger. "Beatrice wounded me once when she needed to establish something. You wounded me continuously. without effort, without intention, and without ever noticing. Because the most honest thing I can tell you is this: she waited until he was looking at her fully. Cruel people wound us once, she said. Silent people teach us we deserve it. Lucas said nothing. He stood in the cold corridor with the expression of a man receiving something he had earned, and knew he had earned. And he did not try to deflect it, and he did not apologize preemptively in the way that people apologized when they wanted the other person to stop telling the truth. He stood and he heard it. That at least, she thought. That finally. I am not asking you to absolve me, he said at last. Good, she said. I am not offering absolution. I am offering you the truth because someone in this house should have offered it to you a long time ago, and everyone was too comfortable to do it. She looked at him steadily. Go back to your dinner, Your Grace. There is a great deal left to resolve in that room, and none of it requires my presence. She turned back to the window. After a moment, his footsteps moved away. She stood in the cold and looked at the bare garden for a long time, and she thought about her mother, who had walked a road carrying a market basket and had dropped it without hesitation, and she thought about what it meant to give something without asking for anything back, and she thought about whether that was nobility or simply the habit of someone who had never been taught to expect return. She had not decided by the time she was ready to move. But she was thinking about it, and thinking about it, she knew from long experience, was always where everything began. Lucas came back into the dining room. He came back differently than he had left it. He had walked out after Anna with the energy of a man motion, and he returned with the energy of a man who had arrived somewhere and understood what was required of him there. And everyone at the table read the difference immediately. He stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He looked at Beatrice. She looked back at him. Her composure was intact. It would always be intact. It was the most durable thing about her. That composure, built from years of understanding, that expression was a liability, and control was survival. She sat with her hands folded, and her chin level and her eyes on his face, and Anna, had she been present, would have seen what Lucas was only now learning to see. That the composure was not calm. It was load-bearing. It was the thing holding everything else up, and it was working very hard. Beatrice, Lucas said. Lucas, her voice was even. He reached into the pocket of his coat. He had put it there before he left for the corridor. He had taken it from the small table in the entrance hall, where it had sat since the night of their formal agreement, which had been conducted in the marshaled drawing room 6 weeks ago, with lawyers present and champagne afterward, and a general atmosphere of satisfactory conclusion. It was a small thing, a token, the kind exchanged between engaged parties in this era as a gesture of intent, simple and symbolic, and in this moment, an object that had the weight of everything it was about to stop meaning. He set it on the table in front of Beatrice. She looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him. You are making a decision, she said, based on an evening of theater arranged by your mother and an old solicitor, designed to. I am making a decision, Lucas said, based on what I heard in this room tonight, and what I heard in the corridor, and what I should have been hearing and choosing to hear for the last several months. He paused. I am not angry with you, Beatrice. She blinked. She had expected anger. She was prepared for anger. Anger was manageable. I am ashamed, he said. That is different. Anger is about what you did. Shame is about what I permitted. He looked at her steadily. I permitted a great deal. I mistook your composure for character. I mistook your efficiency for virtue. I chose, every time something was placed in front of me that I did not want to look at directly, to look somewhere else. He paused. That ends tonight. Beatrice looked at the token on the table. If you do this, she said, and her voice, for the first time all evening, had dropped the pleasantness entirely and was speaking directly, the voice she used in private when she was not performing for a room. My father will make good on everything, he threatened. The legal complications, the financial entanglements, the social. I know, Lucas said. It will cost you considerably. I know. And the girl, she said. And the word came out without its social cushioning, without the careful management that had surrounded every other mention of Anna all evening, and it revealed in its nakedness exactly what Anna had always been to Beatrice. Not a person to be managed, but a fact to be suppressed. She is not going to. Her name, Lucas said quietly, is Miss Whitmore. Beatrice went still. Then Lord Edmund stood again. Blackwood, he said, with the lost deployment of the warmth he had been using all evening, I urge you to consider. One evening's emotion should not. Lord Marshal, Augusta said from her end of the table. Edmund looked at her. Sit down, she said. He sat. Beatrice looked at the token for one more long moment. Then she picked it up, not to return it. She closed her fingers around it and held it with the brief, private intensity of someone saying goodbye to something. And Lucas understood, watching her, that behind all of it, the ambition and the cruelty and the careful performance of everything she had needed to be, there was a person who had wanted this, not him specifically perhaps, but what he represented. Safety, position, the permanent resolution of the fear that ran beneath all of it. He was not unmoved by that, but he was done permitting it to be his problem. She put the token in her pocket. She did not look at him again. Fenwick had his case open on the sideboard. He had, it appeared, been expecting this progression of events, or not expecting it exactly, because Fenwick was a man who dealt in what was documented rather than what was predicted. But he had prepared for it, which in a solicitor was the same discipline, applied in a different direction. He produced the final document with the quiet authority of a man setting the last piece of an argument into its correct position. This, he said, addressing the room, is the Whitmore estate deed. The original. Not the transfer. Not the amended version that Lord Marshal produced in 1811. He held it briefly, so that those who needed to could see the date and the seal. This establishes, in conjunction with the late Duke's letter and the documents of Lady Marianne's lineage that I have held in trust for 14 years, that Miss Anna Whitmore is the legitimate heir of the Whitmore estate and its remaining entitlements. He set it down. The estate was mismanaged and its income redirected, he said, in the dry, precise voice of a man reading a ledger. What remains is diminished, but not negligible. There is a house, there is land, there is an income, if properly reconstituted, sufficient to maintain independence. He looked at Augusta. Your Grace, I believe you wished to make an additional statement. Augusta stood. She stood with the full authority of the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, in the dining room of her family's house, in front of its remaining guests, and she spoke with the clarity of someone who had prepared these words a long time ago, and was finally in the room where they needed to be said. It is the position of this house, she said, that Miss Anna Whitmore, daughter of Lady Marianne Whitmore, is recognized by the Blackwood family as a woman of standing, as the ward whose protection was promised by my late husband, and as someone to whom this family owes a debt that cannot be fully paid, but will, from this evening, be honestly acknowledged. She looked at Lord Harrow, whose eyes had been bright with the specific alertness of a man who would carry this story to every drawing-room in the county within a week. I trust that will be recorded accurately. Harrow inclined his head. Your Grace, I can think of nothing in recent memory more worth recording. Lady Selene March, who had spent the evening in the strategic proximity of Beatrice and was now performing a rapid internal audit of her own social positions, made a sound of agreement that arrived slightly too late to be entirely credible, but arrived nonetheless. Augusta sat. She looked, for the first time all evening, tired. Not defeated, not diminished. Tired in the way that people were tired after they had done something that required everything they had, and had done it well, and were now permitted to feel the cost of it. Edmund Marshall had stopped performing. It happened between one moment and the next, with the specific quality of a man who has been running a very long, very demanding performance and has finally recognized that the audience is no longer with him and the stage is no longer his. He looked at the documents on the sideboard. He looked at Magistrate Reeves, who had taken a position near the door that was not aggressive but was not casual either. It was the position of a man who was present in an official capacity and intended to remain so. He stood. "I will be in my rooms," he said, with the last remnant of the easy authority he had carried all evening. He addressed this to no one in particular, which was itself a kind of defeat. Edmund Marshall had spent his life addressing things to specific people in specific ways for specific effects, and a statement made to no one was a statement that had given up on effect. He moved toward the door. "Lord Marshal Reeves." Edmund stopped. "I mentioned earlier," Reeves said, "that you would be well advised to remain in the county. I want to be precise about what I mean." He was not threatening. He was informing. There was a significant difference, and he delivered it in a way that made the difference clear. The documents Mr. Fenwick has produced will be reviewed formally. There will be questions. Those questions will require answers from you directly, and they will require them in a manner that can be recorded. He paused. "I am not arresting you tonight, my lord. I am telling you that if you leave this county before those questions have been answered, what is currently an investigation becomes something else. I trust you understand the distinction." Edmund looked at him. For a long moment he stood in the doorway of the Blackwood dining room, and he was, finally, simply a man who had done a calculated thing and had miscalculated the distance between what could be managed and what could be proven. "I understand," he said. He went to his rooms. Reeves did not follow him immediately, but Thomas Reed, who had been standing near the door and who had, it emerged, been given quiet instructions by Augusta an hour before dinner, positioned himself in the corridor, in the way that senior footmen positioned themselves when they had been asked to ensure that a particular person did not take it upon themselves to have a horse saddled at midnight. Lady Prudence remained at the table. She sat with extraordinary composure in the manner of a woman who had survived a great many difficult evenings and had decided that composure was the only remaining asset that could not be taken from her. She did not look at Beatrice. Beatrice did not look at her. They had, Anna suspected, a great deal to say to each other, and none of it would be said in this room. Lucas found Anna in the entrance hall. She had retrieved her cloak, not the travel cloak she had carried into Blackwood Hall that morning, which was still somewhere in the drawing room, but her own cloak, the plain dark one that was hers, that she had brought in her small bag, and that belonged to no one but herself. She was wearing it. That was not a good sign, Lucas understood. A woman wearing her cloak in an entrance hall was not a woman planning to stay. "Miss Whitmore." She looked at him. He had thought, walking from the dining room, about what to say. He had composed sentences and discarded them. He had thought about the things that men in his position said when they needed to apologize for things in his position's category. The managed, gracious apologies that acknowledged without fully reckoning, that expressed regret without accepting the specific weight of what the regret was for. He had discarded all of them. He stopped in front of her. And then he did something that he had not planned. That was not, in fact, a plan at all, but an action that arrived from the same place that honest things arrived from, when a person had finally stopped managing themselves. He went to one knee, not as a performance. There was no one watching. The entrance hall was empty except for the two of them, and the candles, and the cold, and the door to the outside that Anna was standing 3 feet from. He went to one knee on the stone floor of his own house, in front of a woman who had carried a cloak through his front door that morning, and he looked up at her. "My mother curtsied to you," he said, "because she recognized you. because she had been looking for you for years, and had been told you were dead, and had never stopped being ashamed that she had believed it. He paused. I kneel because I failed to. Because you were in my household, in houses adjacent to mine, in my social orbit, within reach, and I did not see you, not because you were invisible, because I did not look. Anna looked down at him. Her expression was not the expression of a woman receiving a romantic gesture. It was more complicated than that. It was the expression of a woman who had been told for a very long time that she did not warrant being looked at, who was now being looked at with a directness that was going to require time to absorb. You have spent this evening learning things, she said, that I have lived with my entire life. You will need time to understand what that means. Not the facts of it, but the weight of it. The particular weight of a life that was not permitted to be what it was. She paused. I do not say this to be cruel to you. I say it because you asked me earlier what I wanted, and I did not answer fully, and this is the answer. She looked at him steadily. I want you to understand it. Not to feel terrible about it, not to resolve it with a gesture, but to understand it. The way you understand things that become part of how you see the world. She reached down. She offered him her hand. Not warmly, not with the warmth that the gesture might have carried under other circumstances. With the precise dignity of a woman helping a man off a cold floor, because a cold floor was not what either of them needed. He took it. He stood. He was close enough that she could see, in the candlelight, that what was on his face was not the controlled, managed distress that had occupied it for most of the evening. It was something raw and less polished and considerably more honest. I will, he said, understand it. I am not asking you to trust that now. I am telling you because it is what I intend, and I have spent enough of this evening not saying what I intend, and I am done with that. Anna looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Good night, Your Grace, and she did not take her cloak off, and she moved toward the stairs rather than the door, which was not a declaration, but was, perhaps, a beginning. She stopped on the third step. She did not turn around, but she stopped, and she stood with one hand on the banister and the other holding the front of her cloak, and she said it to the stairs rather than to the room, which was the way she sometimes said things that cost her something. I know what you will expect now, she said. People who have done wrong and understood it expect forgiveness to follow, understanding the way morning follows night, as though the recognition were itself the resolution. She paused. It's not. Lucas was behind her and below her, and she did not look at him. Forgiveness is not a ribbon, she said quietly, to be handed over because shame has finally found you. It is not something I owe you because you knelt on a cold floor and said true things. She was quiet for a moment. I am not telling you I will not forgive you. I am telling you that you cannot demand it. You cannot arrange for it. You cannot produce the correct sequence of gestures and receive it as a result. She finally looked back at him, over her shoulder, briefly. It will come when it comes if it comes on terms that are mine, not because you deserve it, because I decide it. Lucas looked at her. Yes, he said, simply. She turned back to the stairs. You should also know, she said, and the quietness of it was different now. Not the quietness of endurance, but something else, something fractionally less armored. That I do not think you are a bad man. I think you are a man who was comfortable and who chose, every time comfort and truth came into conflict, to remain comfortable. That is not the same as bad. She moved up one more step. It is, however, something you will have to decide whether to continue. She went up the stairs. Lucas stood in the entrance hall for a long time after she had gone. The candles burned. The door held its cold. The clock in the corridor ticked its patient, indifferent tick. The same one it had been ticking all evening through everything. He stood and he thought, which was not what he usually did in difficult moments. He usually moved, usually acted, usually resolved. And the thinking was uncomfortable and did not resolve anything, and was, he understood, exactly what she had asked for. 3 weeks later, in the first real warmth of spring, two women walked in the garden at Blackwood Hall. The roses had not come yet, but the beds had been turned, and the early shoots were visible along the south wall, pale and determined, pushing through soil that had spent the winter forgetting them. The gravel paths were dry for the first time since November. The light was the particular light of English spring mornings, tentative, provisional, carrying the memory of cold but moving away from it. Augusta walked with her customary straight back and her customary unhurried pace, her dark coat buttoned against the residual morning chill. Beside her, Anna walked with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, looking at the garden with the particular attention of someone who was still learning to be somewhere rather than simply moving through it. They had walked together every morning for 2 weeks. It had begun without being proposed. On the third morning after the dinner, Anna had been in the garden when Augusta came out, and Augusta had walked beside her without asking whether she was welcome, which was, Anna had thought at the time, the correct instinct. Asking would have made it formal, would have made it a thing that required a decision, and what it needed to be was simply a thing that happened, morning by morning, until it was familiar. They did not always talk. On the mornings when they talked about Marianne, about the woman who had been, it emerged, considerably more complicated and more vivid and more real than the sainted figure of memory that Augusta had been carrying. About the things Augusta remembered, and was not sure she had remembered correctly. About the things Anna had been told that turned out, in the light of these conversations, to be distortions, not all malicious. Some simply the way that stories degraded as they passed through people who had not known the original. On the mornings when they did not talk, they walked, and the garden moved around them, and the quiet was the quiet of two people who had arrived at the early stages of understanding and were being careful with it. This morning Augusta stopped near the south wall. She looked at the early shoots along the bed. "Your solicitor from the village," she said. Anna had engaged Mr. Fenwick formally now, which was a thing that still felt strange to say, but less strange each time. "Believes the estate income can be restored to something workable within 2 years if the accounts are properly investigated and the misdirected funds are recovered." "He told me the same," Anna said. "Edmund Marshall's cooperation will affect the timeline." "Yes." A pause. "He is cooperating," Augusta said, "more fully than anyone expected. I think because the alternative has been made clear to him in terms he finds persuasive." She said this without satisfaction. She was not a woman who enjoyed other people's exposure, even when she had arranged for it. "Beatrice has returned to London. She has not made public statements. I suspect she will not." Anna nodded. She had thought about Beatrice in these weeks, had thought about her more than she had expected to, and with a complexity she had not anticipated. It was possible, she had found, to understand how someone had become what they were, and still hold them accountable for it. These were not contradictory positions. They simply required holding two things at once, which was uncomfortable but not impossible. "Lucas," Augusta said, and paused. Anna waited. "He has been asking about you," Augusta said. "Not to me directly, through Mrs. Rowe, which means he knows you would hear it and is choosing that channel deliberately." She glanced at Anna with the measured perception of a woman who understood people and was not above pointing out what she understood. "He wants to know if you are well. He wants to know if you need anything. He has not asked to see you." "I know," Anna said. "You know." "He told me he would not ask," Anna said. "That night, he said he would wait until I chose, if I chose, and that he would not arrange for it." She looked at the early roses along the south wall. "I believed him. I was not certain whether to, but I believed him." Augusta looked at her. "And?" she said. The careful neutrality of a woman asking a question she is not certain is hers to ask. Anna was quiet for a moment. "And I think believing him was correct," she said at last. I think it may continue to be correct. I am not yet sure what to do with that. Augusta nodded. She resumed walking. Anna walked beside her in the thin spring light through the garden that was beginning, root by root, to remember what it was meant to be. Later that morning, Lucas was walking the east path when he saw them at a distance, Augusta and Anna, two figures in dark coats moving through the garden with the unhurried ease of people who had found a rhythm together. He watched them for a moment. Then he went inside, because he had said he would wait, and he had meant it, and keeping a promise turned out to be simpler than he had been led to believe. Simpler and harder at once, in the specific way of things that required you to hold yourself still when every instinct said move. He thought about a road in autumn, and a woman with a market basket, and the things she had given without asking anything in return. He thought about what it meant to learn something late. He thought about what it meant to, finally, after a very long time, be worthy of looking. In the garden, the two women walked on. The spring light moved across the south wall. The roses were not yet, but they were coming. That morning, Blackwood Hall learned what every proud house eventually learns. A title may open a door, but character, quiet, costly, and refusing to kneel, decides who deserves to stand inside it.